There are two basic types of alpha male: the extroverted insider alpha and the introverted outsider alpha. Think Thor and Loki, respectively. The reason for this from an evolutionary perspective is pretty clear. As a rule, it's a bad idea to question the basic worldview that your social order depends on, so we don't. We put the extrovert in charge. Extroverts generate their behavior by synthesizing their sense data. Effectively, they are outward focused. So the extroverted Thor, simple-minded Thor, just kind of copies the habits, thoughts, sayings that he sees from the rest of the gods. He synthesizes them, embodies them, channels them. He is that legitimate successor to the authority. But sometimes the basic worldview that people rely on is not enough. It fails, it's no longer adaptive, and you need the trickster. You need the introvert who looks inside their psyche to the underlying forms that the ideal structure of a worldview is composed of, going straight to the source. Loki practices magic, which is not generally a masculine attribute in the Norse system. It's a feminine attribute because magic comes from that undifferentiated chaotic substrate, and Loki looks within it. You could equally use, Zeus and Poseidon, or for that matter, Cyclops and Wolverine. But the sea god imagery of Poseidon is the right idea here. The introverted alpha goes down into the subconscious. This is akin to the division between the tribal chief and the shaman. There are times when the shaman is put in charge. He is de facto the leader. But again, as a rule of thumb, it's probably best if he lives in a hut on the outside of the village, because he has a tendency to, stir things up a little too much. So this develops, however, through time. In the mythological mode of consciousness, it's enough to have a charismatic leader. They can be motivated by this kind of self-reflection and steeping themselves in the subconscious, finding that dream realm, bringing it back to waking life, bringing the vital energy of civilization back. That's sufficient because it emanates from that person. They're effectively psychological mechanisms, and then heroic mechanisms. In the age of Aries, it's great conquerors, leaders, not so much rationalistic philosophers. Like the archetype of the Buddha is an introverted alpha who finds a new path of salvation, a new synthesis of the ideas that he grew up with. But ultimately, primordial Buddhism is not that different from Advaita Vedanta. It's kind of just semantically different. But anyway, he is that figure. As we move into the age of Pisces, things begin to be rationalized. The hero of the age of Pisces, who inaugurates the age, Christ, performs his salvation not through some kind of outward motivated or outward oriented transformation, but by instigating inner transformation. He heals the sick, he causes people to repent, he expels demons, he's fixing people's internal condition, and his ultimate act is more or less a passive one. It's being hung on a cross, because that's the orientation of rational consciousness. It is at its peak when we are least involved in it. When we're not emotionally involved in our reasonings are accurate. So dropping your ego and trusting in Logos, that's the way of this age. But there are two ways that can proceed. The rational mode of consciousness can be oriented towards effectively programming or pure mathematics. We can use reason to discover the nature of things, or we can use reason to create new things. That is effectively the direction of the absolute, the one, divinity on the one hand, and the demiurge, the devil, the chaotic feminine on the other. The dialectic between the two constitutes the whole of reality, and all are subsumed within that absolute order in itself, in an ultimate sense. But anyway, historically speaking, we can either go transhuman, genetic modification, artificial general intelligence, letting computers explore the universe. Like, that'd be a lot of new stuff. But we could get pretty far from God if we go down that path. The potential is massive for that. The other way, and then we lose our heritage. We lose what we were before, and basically negate the divinity of that previous heroic path. The other way to go is not out into just novelty, but back to recontextualize, resynthesize, understand again the foundational kind of mythic substructure on which rational consciousness depends. And that's integral consciousness. You have to perfect the passive rational mindset and let that completely structure the way you think about the world. Let that be your default mode. And then the active part is no longer, as in the rational mode, the kind of, calculating, parsing, analytical thought. All of this is intensely effortful for us in this age. But if you consummate it and integrate it, and you don't have like this or that mathematical problem before you, but math as a kind of transcendental unity with you present as a raw potency, then that's applied by the underlying mythic ego, not the rational ego, but the thumatic ego. And that would be a new kind of alpha. Not an extroverted alpha who just kind of goes with the way things are. Not necessarily the introverted alpha, but the true philosopher king who does perfect himself in this kind of philosophical method and then express it instinctively almost, or like in a kind of inspired way, enthusiastically. So another way of looking at this is using Max Weber's thinking. For Max Weber, society basically originates with that introverted alpha male because he's able to generate a new ideal structure that changes him, his habits, and if the ideal structure resonates with the circumstances that have to be confronted, then those habits resonate as well. They signal as adaptive, and people emulate them. And a community of habit grows around this individual. And you get a social center, people gravitate towards it, that community of habit develops into a community of discourse, the basic ideal structure becomes explicit, maybe the founder dies at that point, the dogmas begin to be systematized by the disciples, and then that process of mimesis and discourse works its way through the entire community. Everyone basically has absorbed the law of the society. Everyone has absorbed those habits. And then that law, which is now abstract, legalistic, is retconned back onto the founder. As a rule, that's what happens. So that's the organic path for the introverted alpha to take to start a new social order. That's the way a mythic consciousness would operate. But with rational consciousness, with this higher degree of agency, the alpha can actually explicate a philosophical system himself, rather than a post hoc legalization or legalism of his original raw energy, what he produces is actually philosophy, which is different from legality. Philosophy, you self-reflectively know that you're answering those basic mythic questions, not in a mythic vein, but a post-mythic vein. And that's what Plato does. He brings about a new kind of order. He's kind of an updated version of that introvert alpha. He plans how society could be and brings people together in a school to seek out that underlying philosophy to use as a basis for organizing people. Our myths, our philosophies, whatever that underlying OS of society is, it's a technology of cooperation. Plato developed a technology of cooperation that transcended the colonies and charters of his Greek world. Right? He wasn't like Solon, just writing a system of laws and seeing how it worked, trial by fire, basically, for the legal system. Instead, he developed a philosophical framework for considering how laws could be formulated in the abstract. And his impact was transnational. It was across the entire Mediterranean, eventually across the entire world. Because of him, we had Aristotle. Because of Aristotle, his influence on Alexander, and probably Plato's influence on Alexander, we had the Library of Alexandria. We had the research institution that developed there that was kind of like Plato's Academy, but just on a much larger scale. You had Euclid develop the elements there. You had all sorts of Greek mathematicians make innovations at Alexandria. You wouldn't have had Archimedes. You wouldn't have had Roman engineering. You wouldn't have had Western civilization if you didn't have Plato's reconstituting of the foundational framework. But then eventually that did arrive at a kind of legalism. We had the Aristotelian, primarily scholastic framework of the Middle Ages, and they came up with innovations as well, and it was rigorous in a lot of ways. I'm not anti-Thomism per se. I don't think it's complete. I think basically it's like masking its obvious perennialist and Platonic influences, and can't be thoroughly systematic without undercutting its kind of exoteric Christian pretext for existing. But anyway, out of that, once it becomes rigid, once it seems unadapted to the beginnings of scientific empirical inquiry, you have Francis Bacon, who says, we don't need a set of guardians practicing pure mathematics. What we need is empirical scientists running experiments, seeing what happens, and actually we're going to experiment with the very structure of our society. And New Atlantis is not this kind of city of God, self-isolating, ascetically inclined group. The New Atlantis is a secret group which brings merchants and scientists from all over the world, studies all the cultures of the world, has towers in the sky for studying the thin air up there, has wells down deep and instruments to measure the density of the air. They're experimenting, they're generating, they're trying to control the world. And that's the OS of the ruling elite. Francis Bacon systematizes it, has a real impact on the way that it manifests in the philosophers that led to the Anglo-American establishment. But he's not, obviously, the only source going into the elite group. I think there's covert elements that already had that kind of empirical, experimental mindset at a much earlier date, but they were just secret earlier on. Like Francis Bacon might have been a relatively latecomer to that kind of secret society mindset. But anyway, he probably does live on past when we think he dies, historically speaking. Probably moves to Germany, assumes the label Christian Rosenkreuz. Probably did write the Shakespeare plays with a team of writers under his control for propagandistic purposes to bring about this re-engineering of society, all covertly from this enlightened class. So it's similar to Plato's innovation, but taking it a step forward. It's a kind of dialectics that's playing out here. And that can go, rationalism can go one of two ways. The Baconian, Faustian path of basically programming and creating new orders, or the more Platonic and pure mathematical path of discovering the true order and discovering the best for man, not creating and experimenting, but finding. A blend of these two is also on the table. But when we're looking for how we can cooperate, in the background, what we're looking for is this new figure to bring about a new ideal structure, a philosophy, but something beyond a philosophy, right? Because in the past, we wanted a myth, we wanted a religion. Now we think of it in philosophical, rational terms, but there is a next level beyond rationalistic philosophy. I think we have to have at least that, but there's something beyond that level, maybe involving psi abilities, right? What does philosophy allow us to do? It allows us to agree on metaphysical propositions, epistemological propositions, ultimately, most importantly, ethical propositions. So we can have not just the shared values of our time and place, the shared goals or common enemies that we confront, but the same answer to the question of what is good for man. And then we can cooperate no matter what, because we have the same basic intention here. So that's why philosophy is necessary. It's a technology of cooperation. It aligns values. So we need to have conversations and reach that philosophical consensus. But before the mythic consciousness even, the way that we aligned those intentions was more mimetic, and we read each other physically. Animals read each other physically. There's a way of integrating that rationalistic philosophical structure with our biological nature and having it not just be a thought, but a spirit, something that moves through a community and unifies that community beyond a rationalistic level. Not a constitution to organize us, but a collective mind, something beyond the level of the individual, a spirit. How do you achieve that? Well, you can go back and yearn for the days of leadership by Thor, leadership by the charismatic who embodies the spirit of the tribe and shows it to us and like, yeah, this is us. All right, let's go to war. That's the throwback. The way to synthesize it with the history that has come to pass in the meantime is to realize that those philosophical symbols, the language that we use, are signposts that guide ultimately cooperation for us. And they can therefore be engineered not just for abstract philosophical truth, which they do need to be, but also to facilitate non-linguistic parapsychological associations. And my own philosophical system has clues as to how you would do that, but it's a matter of organizing signs, establishing shared reference, shared associations, shared physical environments, and bringing about a unity, bringing about brotherhood and communal love that is able to compete. Because that's what I'm describing here, the evolutionary context, why the two alphas, why our hesitancy to accept someone who comes up with a novel system. We're skeptical. Our monkey brain says, that's dangerous, I want Thor. Where's Thor? But there's something beyond those instincts. There's the next level that we can get to. We're looking to be adaptive. We're looking to grow, to build powerful institutions that will allow us to survive. Because the environment is closing in on us, the environment in the form of the elites. They're taking their Baconian Faustian path of re-engineering everything in their image and wiping us out in the process. The only real path is to find a way of reaching in a collective integral consciousness. And that has to be done at least through philosophical means, but also artistic and other means. And it doesn't really start with abstraction. It starts with a turn of heart. That's what opens up for philosophical discourse in the first place. I want to hear what you have to say. So maybe that's a better starting point than all of this talk of our mythological heritage, different consciousness structures, the passing of one age into another. we are coming up on Aquarius. In Aquarius, the rationalization process is no longer subterranean. It's pulled out into the air, and we hold that water. We direct that water. We know how these parapsychological subconscious elements work, and we direct them. But we're not there yet because we haven't consummated the age. We haven't really submitted ourselves to Christ, Logos. That's where we are now. We have to love each other, love God, love truth, love each other. How do we love truth and each other at the same time? Philosophy. Plato was right, but also we have to go beyond Plato. Hopefully you got something out of this. I think we're part of a movement, not a political movement, but a movement of soul through time. And this is what our calling is. We have to talk to each other and discuss metaphysics. That's what it comes down to. So if you want to do that with me, I'll leave my Skype and my Discord in the description, as well as my Patreon and PayPal links. So if you want to support what I'm doing, I'm trying to build a school so we can have this kind of philosophical discourse and beyond. And also I'll leave those Skype and Discord links so that you can talk, or if you have questions, then we can do that. But thank you guys for listening.